Hello all, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. We have already covered on this channel the cases about crazy fans, like for example the case of Ricardo Lopez, who was obsessed with Björk, who was slowly descending into madness and had a terrible end for him. Fortunately, nothing happened to the artist in this story. The video is at the end or in the playlist below if you want to see it. Today we are going to meet another crazy fan. We'll study Mark Chapman's story, who had an obsession with John Lennon. John Lennon, the one from the Beatles, the Beatle who is probably the most popular of the Beatles. And what happened when John Lennon crossed paths with Mark Chapman? Well, something quite sad happened that we are going to learn about today. We are going to be analyzing who Mark Chapman was, why he became obsessed with John Lennon, how he built up this obsession step by step, how he planned to carry out what he had in mind. We'll learn about it today. But before we start, I want to remind you that on this channel we have your 10 seconds, which is where YouTubers, streamers, Instagrammers, and others promote their networks, and your 10 seconds today are for Soke. Soke is a Twitch streamer who streams Fortnite, Valorant, League of Legends, and other games. He promises to stream every day this 2020, so I leave his Twitch channel below for you to go see him and give him your support. In addition to that, I remind you that if you want to see this case and others uncensored without advertising and 24 hours before the rest, you have to click the button that says join below to join the Mephisto clan. Then click on Dark Master and then go to the community tab where you will find the entire list of all the videos that have been released so far uncensored, and you can watch one after the other. Now without further delay, let's start with today's video. For the superstitious, the year 1966 was one of the beast's years, along with the year 1666, 1669, 1696, 1699, 1969, 1996, and 1999. Why? Because these years contain 666 either up or down. I don't believe much in this kind of numerology and stuff, but it seems it was a bad year for many people, including the Beatles. In that year precisely, they would take the first steps of a chain of events that would end in tragedy, in death, and in a lot of sadness for everyone. 1966 signifies 3 scandals for the Beatles. The first one was when John Lennon in an interview in March said that Christianity was slowly disappearing and that they would soon surpass it, because the Beatles at that time were more popular than Jesus Christ. This particular saying might not make as much noise now, but at that time people were more Christian, more conservative, much more believing, so it caused many Christian Beatles fans to stop following them, get terribly angry with them, start burning their records, start burning pictures, hold protests, and so on. And in addition to that, these sayings reached the ears of a young man named Mark Chapman, who never forgot them. And this phrase had its end in front of the Dakota building in December of 1980. But going back to the year 1966, on June 15th of that year, the Beatles' album Yesterday and Today came out. The unusual thing about this album is that on the cover were the 4 from Liverpool, but not dressed in their typical English suit, but they were wearing a butcher's apron. They were stained with blood. They had knives in their hands, and they used dolls symbolizing babies, as if they were dismembering babies. This photo had also been based on an idea by John Lennon and had been taken by the photographer Roger Whittaker. Obviously, their manager first opposed using this photograph as the album cover, but he couldn't do much. The photo came out and caused a scandal, first appearing in a newspaper and then in the Capitol record store. One of the most famous record stores at that time. There was such a stir that they had to take the records off sale. What happened is that the record was soon available again for fans to buy, but with another cover it was censored. John Lennon gave another of his controversial statements and said that the issue of censorship to the cover of his album was almost as important as the Vietnam War, and there was a last unfortunate event for them that occurred on July 7th of 1966. They were on a tour, and one of the stops on this tour was the country Philippines. There, about 50,000 fans blocked the entrance of the plane to Manila Airport to see them. The next day, they sang in front of 100,000 people at the Araneta Coliseum. However, they made a mistake. Imelda Marcos, the First Lady of the Philippines, invited them to a dinner. She prepared a grand dinner as a treat for these international stars, but they did not want to go. They decided to stay at the hotel. Well, what happened? It seems that things in the Philippines were not very good with the government at that time, and everything got very murky for the Beatles. The wife of the then president of the Philippines, Ferdinando Marcos, appeared crying in the media, talking about the contempt that had been shown to these artists. Then, the military showed up at the hotel where they were staying. They hurried them out, put them on a plane, and held them for hours inside this plane. Brian Epstein and other members of the Beatles team were completely scared and said later that they thought they were going to be shot right there. Well, the point is that after this scare they let them go, but they never forgot this event. On November 8, 1966, John Lennon meets Yoko Ono at an exhibition he attended. The countdown to his tragedy is underway. The next day, on November 9, 1966, something happens that is still talked about to this day. The biggest conspiracy surrounding the Beatles. The alleged death of Paul McCartney. You've probably been around some conspiracy forums and the like. I've heard about this theory that Paul McCartney actually died in 1966 and was replaced by a look-alike who was trained by the producers so that the Beatles' popularity wouldn't decline, to not lose the fans. It's one of the weirdest theories I've ever read in my life. But the crazy thing is that at some point it makes some sense and makes you doubt whether this is true or not. The thing is, all this happened in 1966. For now, let's freeze the Beatles there with this chain of unfortunate events. And let's go to the protagonist of this story. Let's meet Mark Chapman. Mark David Chapman was born on May 10, 1955 in Texas, southern United States. As a child, he suffered from obesity problems, which led to school bullying, made him introverted, and earned him the nickname Mark the Freak. His father, David Curtis Chapman, was a sergeant in the United States Air Force, and his mother, Catherine Elizabeth Pease, was a nurse. His sister Susan was born 7 years later. Chapman stated that he was afraid of his father as a child since he physically abused his wife and son. At 14 years old, Mark was taking drugs, skipping school, and even ran away from home and lived on the street for 2 weeks. At that time, he was consuming marijuana, cocaine, acid, heroin, mescaline, and barbitúricos. His favorite band at the time was the Beatles. With all these problems, Mark created a parallel reality in his head that helped him escape from his real life. He believed his life was being controlled by little dwarfs living in his room. In 1971, he decided to amend his life, get back on track, and enrolled in the famous Young Men's Christian Association known as Young Men's Christian Association. By then, John Lennon and Jesus Christ were of equal importance in his life. Those who knew him in this association, as well as in the subsequent jobs he had, said he was an exceptional person. Then a friend suggested a book to him, a book that would completely change his life. It was called The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. The reading of his book was so important, it impacted him so much that he declared he even wanted to resemble the protagonist, named Holden Caulfield. On March 4, 1966, John Lennon made some quite controversial statements that I have already told you about, and, unknowingly, that same day, he signed his death sentence. In the Evening Saturday newspaper, this interview conducted by journalist Maureen Cleavey was published, where Lennon literally said, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I don't need to argue about this, I'm right and I will prove it. The Beatles are more popular than Jesus Christ right now." This supposedly harmless statement is republished later, on July 31st in Datebook magazine, which prompts opposition to the Beatles in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan threatens to carry out attacks if the Beatles perform. And thousands of young people protest with banners that said phrases like, "Jesus died for you, John Lennon." Christian groups called these young people to attend the so-called Beatles bonfires, where they obviously prepared a large fire and threw the vinyls, newspaper clippings, photos, posters, everything they had from the Beatles. The largest mobilization of this kind took place in Birmingham, Alabama. In the following days, dozens of radio stations refused to play the band's songs, and the situation worsened when the band refused to play in South Africa in protest of the apartheid that prohibited people of color from entering their concerts. For this reason, many groups in South Africa joined the protests in the United States and also decided to stop playing songs from this Liverpool group. The Philippines joins the global hatred for what had happened with the First Lady when they visited. And in Spain, the dictator Francisco Franco orders the same thing, to set everything of the Beatles on fire. In August of 1966, they also go on a tour in the United States. On August 19th, at the concert held at the Memphis Coliseum, the Ku Klux Klan carries out an attack. There's an explosion in the lobby and John Lennon throws himself on the floor in the middle of the stage thinking they are being shot at. Meanwhile, the Vatican, which initially expressed its condemnation of John Lennon's statements, ends up agreeing with him. The Roman Observatory publishes that there is some truth in this strong statement that says the influence of Christianity on the human race has weakened. On August 29th, due to this and other pressures, they will give their last concert in front of an audience that had paid for their tickets. It is held at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. Finally, a perplexed John Lennon, a bit surprised by everything that had happened, speaks in front of the camera and apologizes. But what he doesn't know is that in a Christian camp in Atlanta, a young man named Mark David Chapman had read what he had said, a young man who had become a Christian fanatic relatively recently, and was beginning to harbor a great resentment towards him for these statements. It is for this reason that he began to plan his revenge against his former idol for having said these things about Jesus. Mark Chapman says to a friend after reading John Lennon's words, "Who are they to compare themselves with Jesus?" Sometime later, he will take a guitar and sing at a bonfire in front of his friends from the Young Men's Christian Association, this Christian club, the song Imagine by John Lennon, but changing the lyrics and saying, "Imagine that John Lennon is dead." The years pass, and while John Lennon marries Yoko Ono and they have a son, the Beatles break up and Lennon disappears from public view for a long time. Meanwhile, Chapman grows up and gets a job as a security guard at a place in Atlanta. Around that time, he had his first girlfriend named Jessica Blankenship, who was a fervently Christian girl who ended up rejecting his marriage proposal. In 1977, Mark Chapman decided to commit suicide by carbon monoxide asphyxiation. He connected a vacuum cleaner hose to the exhaust pipe of his car and put the other end inside. But the hose melted in the exhaust pipe and the suicide attempt failed. A psychiatrist admitted him to Castle Memorial Hospital for his depression. After leaving there, the hospital hired him part-time to also work as a guard. In that job, he played the guitar for the patients and brightened their lives a bit. He moved in with a friend who worked as a Presbyterian minister, and meanwhile his parents began the process of divorce, and sometime later his mother went to live with Mark Chapman in Hawaii. In 1978, Mark Chapman made a trip around the world, partially inspired by a movie he had liked a lot, Around the World in 80 Days. There he visited places like Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, Singapore, Bangkok, New Delhi, Beirut, Geneva, London, Paris, and Dublin. He began a romantic relationship with his travel agent, a Japanese-American woman named Gloria Ave, and they got married on June 2, 1979. Gloria's physical resemblance to Yoko Ono was completely undeniable. After trying several jobs and not lasting in any of them, he finally became unemployed and spent his days drinking beer and reading at the public library. There, among other things, he was looking for answers about his life. It's there where he discovers 2 books that would change his life. He had already read the first one in his adolescence, but he had forgotten it for several years. The Catcher in the Rye. reappears before Mark Chapman's eyes as a sign, as if saying, "Don't forget what you read here, don't forget this character, this is your life." He also found another book, one called John Lennon, One Day at a Time, written by Anthony Fowles, where the former Beatle was completely demystified in Chapman's eyes, who also revived his old grudge against him. He later told his biographer Jack Jones in over 200 hours of interviews, "I realized that I had not succeeded, but he had, and I felt that he had sold out. I wanted him because I couldn't stand being a nobody anymore. I was drowning. This condition was suffocating me." By 1980, John Lennon realized he had only one option in his life: to be reborn and re-emerge as the great pop star he once was. By then, he had spent more than 5 years locked in a 7-room apartment he had bought, where he lived with his wife and son. He gave practically no interviews. He did nothing. He basically spent all day reading, listening to music, contemplating life. But he began to miss that life he once had. That pop star life, traveling here and there. The interviews, the photos they took of him, the fans. He began to miss all that and said, "I have to go back. I have to show the world who John Lennon was." So he set out and began to plan a new album. This is how he manages to compose Double Fantasy, an album that contains songs like "I'm Losing You, Dear Joko," "Watching the Wheels," "Just Like Standover," and "Woman." This happened in August of 1980. What's particular is that when Yoko Ono saw that he was composing again, she insisted that it had to be a record of the two of them. But Lennon told her, "No, this one I'm going to release alone." On October 9th, 1980, John Lennon turns 40 years old. That same day, his son Gene turns 5 years old. And also on that date, but quite far away in Honolulu, Hawaii, Mark David Chapman buys a Charter Arms Specials .38 caliber revolver. He gets it at a gun shop located a block from the local police station. By the 22nd of October that year, Mark Chapman resigns from his job as a security guard in Hawaii and signs his last exit from that job as John Lennon. Around that time, he begins to approach Satanism, occultism, dark arts, but he never fully immerses himself in it. At home, his wife Gloria witnesses Mark Chapman's strange rituals, who spends every afternoon listening to the Beatles records naked while changing the lyrics to murderous phrases that he records on a tape recorder, along with squeals reminiscent of a pig asking Satan for help as part of his delusions, and his violence turns against his wife, whom he hits and breaks all her belongings. In that fit of madness, he also destroys his entire Beatles vinyl collection. Chapman escapes, but before he asks his father-in-law for money to travel to New York. He makes this trip and stays at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. He goes to the Dakota building where John Lennon lived with Yoko Ono and their son, and befriends the building manager Jose Perdomo, who starts giving him a lot of information about John Lennon's life to this complete stranger. But something goes wrong with his plan. He can't get bullets for the revolver he bought because he never registered it. On November 5th, Chapman contacts Dana Rips, a sheriff from Atlanta, who was a friend of his with whom he spends several days learning how to shoot. This sheriff is the one who provides him with 5 hollow point bullets. On November 9th, Chapman watches the movie Ordinary People. This movie deeply moves him and makes him completely change his mind. He regrets his plan to assassinate John Lennon, packs his things, and returns to Hawaii. He gets rid of his copy of The Catcher in the Rye but keeps the revolver with the bullets. He apologizes to his wife and tells her, among other things, that he had been obsessed with killing John Lennon, but that it's over now, that he's okay now. In fact, he sets up an appointment with a psychologist to help him resolve his psychological issues, but this appointment never happens. Meanwhile, the Double Fantasy album goes on sale on November 14th, 1980 and is an instant success. It quickly climbs to the top ranks of the charts. It's the much-anticipated return of John Lennon. A lot of projects stemming from this album start to emerge, including many photo sessions between Lennon and Jogon. In December of 1980, Mark Chapman boards a plane to New York once again. During the flight, he continues to read The Catcher in the Rye once again. On the 6th of December that year, Mark Chapman disembarks in New York with $5,000 in his pocket that his wife had lent him. He checks into a Young Men's Christian Association hotel, and after leaving his things, he heads back to the Dakota building where he meets the security guards and befriends them, starting to ask them a lot of questions about John Lennon's schedule. What time he left the building, what time he returned, who he met with, whether he went out alone, if he went out with people, and surprisingly, the security guards tell him absolutely everything. It is at that moment that Chapman begins to believe he is Holden Caulfield, the protagonist of the book The Catcher in the Rye. That same day, he meets Jerry Moll and Judith Stein, two fanatical John Lennon fans who always waited for him at the exit of the Dakota building. They quickly become friends with Mark Chapman, who introduces himself as a huge Beatles fan. And after chatting for a while and exchanging information about this artist, the girls go to the cinema together and Mark Chapman waits for a while at the door. But then he also leaves. The girls return that same day at 17:15, but Mark Chapman is no longer at the door. At 17:30, John Lennon leaves the building. He meets the girls and talks with them for a moment. That same night, Mark Chapman, staying at the Young Men's Christian Association hotel, this Christian youth hotel, hears two fellow guests planning a homosexual threesome with another friend. In an interview, Mark Chapman expressed that at that moment he felt the urge to grab his gun and shoot them all, but he held back, packed his things, and left the place. He then went to the Gereton Hotel, where he stayed in room 2730. The day after his arrival in New York, on the 7th of December 1980 in the morning, Mark Chapman heads back to the Dakota building. On the way, he buys a copy of Playboy magazine, which includes an interview with John Lennon and Yoko Ono about the presentation of the Double Fantasy album. He also buys another copy of the book The Catcher in the Rye, and some photographs of Judy Garland in the movie The Wizard of Oz. He then returns to the Gereton Hotel and calls an escort service who sent him a prostitute. On Monday, December 8th, around 3 in the morning, this prostitute leaves Mark Chapman's room. Immediately after, he grabs a Bible that he found there in the hotel. In one of the drawers, grabs a pen and writes, "In the Gospel according to St. John." In English, he adds Lennon, so it becomes the Gospel according to St. John Lennon. Chapman sets the alarm and soon falls asleep. He wakes up before his alarm goes off and is certain that this is the day. He packs his things in the hotel room and lays out a Todd Rundgren audio tape on the bathroom sink. Some photos from his volunteer work at Fort Knox. The pictures of Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz that he had bought at the newsstand. And a copy of The Catcher in the Rye where he writes, "This is my statement. I am Mark David Chapman, the Catcher in the Rye." He goes out and buys another copy of the book. It's 9:30 in the morning. Meanwhile, John Lennon has breakfast and goes to get his hair cut. Mark Chapman heads back to the Dakota building. When John Lennon returns from the barber at 10 in the morning, Chapman is busy reading the book again and doesn't see him enter. At 11 in the morning, Judith Stein arrives again, the girl he had met the day before, a John Lennon fanatic, along with photographer Paul Goresh, who was an amateur who always hung around the area and always ended up taking photos of John Lennon with the fans who approached the door of his building. Judith Stein introduces the photographer to Mark Chapman. They shake hands and the photographer sees that Mark Chapman had a copy of Double Fantasy, Lennon's new album. By 11:30 that day, John Lennon is in a photo shoot. Annie Leibovitz is the photographer. She asks John Lennon to undress and he complies. She then takes a legendary photo, where John Lennon is naked in the fetal position, hugging Yoko Ono, who is dressed and lying on the floor. This photo would become one of the most famous covers of Rolling Stone magazine. At 11:50, Mark Chapman gets hungry and invites Judith Stein to lunch. Paul Goresh stays there at the door until the two return later. At 12:30, Gene Lennon, John's son, leaves the Dakota building with his nanny Helen Simon. Judith Stein introduces Mark Chapman to John Lennon. The 5-year-old boy shakes hands with the man who would become his father's killer. At 17 o'clock, when leaving their home, John Lennon and Yoko Ono meet a tall, robust young man on the street, who, encouraged by the photographer Paul Goresh, approaches John with his copy of Double Fantasy, and says to John, "I just bought this copy of your new album, and I loved it. Would you sign it for me, please?" John Lennon then signs the album for Mark Chapman. The photographer Paul Goresh captures this situation in a photograph that would become historic. Chapman thanks him, and John Lennon looks at him and asks in a very mysterious way, "Is that all you want?" Chapman responds yes. John insists. He asks again, "Is that really all you want?" And Chapman answers, yes, that's all. "Thank you very much, John." Then Lennon walks away. Mark Chapman looks at the photographer Paul Goresh, very happy with his autographed copy, and says nobody in Hawaii is going to believe this. John and Yoko get into a white limousine and head to a recording studio called Record Plant located on 44th Street. There they are putting the final touches on a album that is scheduled to be released in early 1981. It's 8 o'clock at the front of the Dakota building. Paul Goresh, the photographer, gets tired, says goodbye to Mark Chapman and tells him, "It's better if we both leave. It's very late. John Lennon is probably going to bed. Let's not wait for him. Another day we will surely cross paths again, and we will chat with him." And Mark Chapman replies, "What if you never see him again?" Meanwhile, Yoko and John stayed 5.5 hours in the studio. It's already 10:30. Among other things, they complete the song, "Walking on These Eyes," which is the last song Lennon composes and records, and he intends it to be a single by Yoko Ono. When leaving the studio, John Lennon tells his producer Jack Douglas, "We will return tomorrow at 9 to give the final details. Now Yoko and I are going home." Douglas notices him happy. He takes a tape with a copy of the new song. John and Yoko leave the studio. At 10:35, John Lennon signs the last autograph of his life to Robbie Pinson, the doorman of the recording studio. They stop on the way to a restaurant where they buy sandwiches and coffee. Then they return to the Dakota building in their white limousine. They arrive there at 23:30 hours. The street is empty. It's 10 degrees. John and Yoko get out of the car. They walk towards the entrance of the building. At one point, Yoko moves ahead, walks past Chapman, who greets her, but she does not return the greeting. Lennon comes behind, still with the tape under his arm. He looks at Mark Chapman, seemingly recognizing him but doesn't greet him. He keeps moving forward. Yoko is there in front of the entrance hall of the building. As soon as he turns his back, a deep voice is heard from the shadows of the central hall. It's Mark David Chapman who shouts, "Hey John," but he squats down. John Lennon turns around to see what's going on. And Yoko Ono also turns around, already opening the building's door. Mark Chapman gets into the Marines' combat stance. Yoko Ono stares at the young man who had asked her husband for an autograph hours earlier and who has waited there for hours for their return. Chapman fires 5 times, and all 5 expanding bullets given to him by his friend the sheriff hit the target. The doorman, Joe Son-si Perdomo, rushes over and snatches the gun away with a swipe of his hand. He then kicks the gun into some bushes and yells, "Look what you've done!" John Lennon yells, "I've been shot!" and staggers a few meters towards the security guard's post, the same guards who had given Mark Chapman all the information about Lennon's entry and exit times from the building. Lennon doesn't make it to the post. He collapses on the floor while Yoko Ono screams. "They're shooting, call the police." The security guard Jade Hanks calls 911. And 45 seconds later, a patrol that was 2 blocks away from the building shows up. By then, several people who have witnessed the event run towards Yoko Ono, who is desperately screaming for help. Meanwhile, Lennon whispers, "Why now?" Not now, but he can't add anything else. One of the shots hit him in the throat. Chapman, meanwhile, remains standing, watching the scene. Then he hides in an alley. Chapman doesn't flee, despite the subway station being just 15 meters away. One of the policemen who showed up, named Steven Spiro, went into an alley and found him with his back turned, hands raised. He grabbed him tightly by the neck and subdued him. Then more patrol cars arrive with police from the 82 precinct. Several police officers hold the motionless Mark Chapman, who indicates to them that the coat lying on the ground and the book of the catcher in the rye that is also lying there belong to him. The police then handcuff him, put him in the patrol car and take him to the station. One of the officers curses and insults him all the way. Other officers run towards Lennon. They have called for an ambulance, but the musician is losing too much blood. Yoko Ono picks up John Lennon's glasses, which are also stained with blood, and puts them away. An officer named John Moran decides to take him to the hospital in his patrol car. He puts his arms around Lennon's back to help him up. While looking at him, he asks, "Are you John Lennon?" Exhausted, the latter only has the strength to nod. Moran settles Lennon in the back seat of his patrol car and takes him to Roosevelt Hospital. In another patrol car, Officer Anthony Pellman is in charge of transporting Yoko Ono, who at that moment is hysterical. Lennon is still alive and constantly complaining. He has his eyes closed and is breathing with difficulty. Upon arriving at the hospital, he stops breathing. They take him down and then put him in an emergency room. The doctors and nurses treating him do not know who he is, until they undress him, start checking his belongings, and want to record his details and find his identification. Even then, they don't believe it. They think it's just a guy named John Lennon who looks like John Lennon but is not the real Lennon. Then Yoko Ono arrives at the hospital and the surprise freezes everyone. Just at that moment, a producer from American Broadcasting Company was at the hospital. He finds out about everything that happened, calls the television station, and gives them the news. Host Howard Cosell then interrupts a sports program and tells the world about the attack. Stephen Lane, the medical director of this area, desperately tries to replace the lost blood and get John Lennon to breathe again. A legend is dying on them. He's given transfusions and taken to the operating room. They perform a thoracotomy on him, but it's all in vain. John Lennon dies within minutes. There are 7 bullet holes in his body because 2 of them went through him. 3 bullets hit his chest, 1 shattered part of his heart, and 2 pulverized his left vessel as they exited through the side. 2 others wounded him in the back and pierced his lungs. Lynn then approaches Yoko Ono and gives her the bad news. She then pleads with him not to tell the press until she returns to her home and tells her little son. By the time the news of her death is made official at 2350, more than 600 people gather in front of the Dakota building and begin to light candles. They are there singing Beatles songs and John Lennon's own throughout the night. On Tuesday, December 9th, Ringo Starr and his wife return to New York. They speak from a public phone at the airport and offer themselves to Yoko Ono to take care of her son. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the phone lines are saturated with people calling in asking unbelievable questions. Like if John Lennon's body was frozen, if his brain was saved, or if sperm samples were kept. Newspapers around the world are echoing the news. Death certificates start to sell. The sale of death certificates indicates the body will be cremated. On December 10th, at the Ferncliff Crematorium in New York, the crematorium director begins to be called by journalists and refuses to give details. Yoko then asks for the body to be cremated and not to tell anyone where his ashes are going to be scattered. But before any movement, a morgue employee manages to take a photograph of John Lennon's corpse. This photograph is sold to the newspapers for $10,000. In contrast, in Paris, thousands of young people gather to sing Beatles songs. And in Germany, the 2 Germanys at that time were divided by the Berlin Wall. Hundreds of young people gather on both sides of this wall singing Beatles and John Lennon songs. On December 14th, 10 days before Christmas, Yoko Ono asks for 10 minutes of silence as a tribute. Around the world, thousands of people join this tribute. Even many radio stations go off the air for these 10 minutes. In Central Park, in front of the Dakota building, Strawberry Field is created. A special site in commemoration of Lennon with a large plaque that says Imagine. A Beatles fan is found shortly after the murder lying among some bushes. the double fantasy album, the one that John Lennon had signed for Mark Chapman. So the first thing he does is hand this album over as evidence to the police. Surprisingly, the police returned the record sometime later to the person who found it with a thank you note. And several years later, he put it up for sale for $500,000. During the auction that was made of this record, in addition to showing the photo that was taken where John Lennon appeared signing it for Mark Chapman, it is said that this album is worth so much because it contains the John Lennon's autograph dedicated to Mark Chapman, his murderer, and it also contains Chapman's fingerprints. Meanwhile, Mark Chapman pleads not guilty by insanity. Sometime later, he ends up pleading guilty, thus avoiding a trial interned on Ricker Island. He says he receives a message from God who asks him to plead guilty even though he is not, so he obeys. He is sentenced to life imprisonment. He is transferred to a van without windows covered by several bulletproof vests, and by guards carrying automatic weapons, he is taken to Attica prison, where he serves his sentence there. According to the security guards, he constantly goes crazy, he is quite irate and starts to scream and break things. He later exchanges correspondence with Officer Steven Spiro, the same one who had arrested him in the alley, and in one of these letters he confesses that he also planned to kill Jody Carson, George C. Scott, Walter Cronkite, Jackie Onassis, and Marlon Brando. Meanwhile, Gloria Chapman remains faithful to her husband, makes conjugal visits 4 times a year, and tells the press that once someone gets married, it's forever. By 1981, Yoko Ono releases an album called Season of Glass, whose cover is a glass of water next to which rests John Lennon's blood-stained glasses. You can see New York City in the background. Yoko Ono receives dozens of threats because of this cover. Mark Chalmers, meanwhile, is exorcised by a priest in 1985. He claims that 5 demons came out of him. In 1996, a companion of Zelda, the Mark Chapman, declares that he was talking to this madman and that he told him he planned to kill the other 3 Beatles. He claims that he continued to be obsessed with them and that he has a tattoo on his right arm composed of John Lennon's name, the word lonely, 2 hearts, a gun, and the initials FFIN, which mean vacation for your next. Something like fabulous for your next. According to this surreal version, the killer has images of the Beatles and a photograph of John Lennon's corpse stuck on the walls of his cell. According to his cellmate, Chapman believes that the rest of the band members should die because they used John Lennon's death to make money. Meanwhile, Chapman declares to the jury, "I've put the last nail in the coffin of the 60s. It was a ruse. He didn't seek his signature but his life, and I ended up getting both. There was a voice in my head saying, do it, do it." Read The Catcher in the Rye. There are all the answers. Read it and you will understand everything. After these statements, some Beatles fans said that if they found Mark Chapman on the street, they would kill him. The problem was that this situation began to inspire a bunch of crazies who started thinking about killing other celebrities. On March 30th, 1981, John Hinckley, obsessed with actress Judy Foster and her role as a prostitute in the movie Taxi Driver, decides to assassinate the then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, in order to impress his impossible love. He shoots 5 times but does not achieve his goal, although he hits the White House press secretary, a police officer, and a security guard in the head. Hinckley declares himself an admirer of Mark Chapman and even visits the Dakota Building on several occasions. Shortly after, in 1982, another man obsessed with Judy Foster tried to kill her, which is why she left the United States for many years. Years later, Robert John Bardo, the murderer of actress Rebecca Sheffer, writes a letter to Mark Chapman in jail asking for advice on how to commit the murder. On July 17, 1989, Bardo guns down Shaffer. Shortly before, like Hinckley, he had made a strange pilgrimage to the Dakota Building. After the murder of John Lennon, paranoia overcomes George Harrison, who buys an island, fortifies it, and secludes himself on it as if it were a fortress. He leaves there years later only to be the victim of an attack perpetrated by Michael Abrams, the defense attorney of this frustrated murderer. He paints his client as a tortured guy who believes the Beatles are witches and that he has to kill George Harrison by God's order. The jury believes him, and this saves him from being found guilty of attempted murder of George Harrison and his wife Olivia, whom he attacks with a knife before entering their house on December 30th, 1999. Neither do the McCartneys escape this curse, and his wife Linda is kidnapped in the mid-90s. Years later, both die of cancer. Both George Harrison and Linda McCartney, and the dark legend of the Beatles continues to spread. Meanwhile, in prison, Mark Chapman begins to receive many letters, both from admirers and from people who wish him death. To somewhat entrust himself and try to cleanse his sins, he begins to run a Christian newspaper. On the internet, a conspiracy page claims that John Lennon is alive and that all of this was a setup, that the Central Intelligence Agency was looking for him because he had discovered that in the 60s he had supported a hippie terrorist group. This and a Federal Bureau of Investigation file linking him to the Irish Republican Army terrorist group finally convinced them. John Lennon had faked his murder with the help of Yoko Ono, who had been supported by the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, in exchange for a lot of money and part of his copyright. According to this theory, the guy couldn't help but continue making music, and years later reappeared producing an artist named Beck. In fact, they say there is a Beck song that if played backwards, you can hear the message, "John is alive, he's just kidding," something like, "John is alive, he was just joking." This theory holds that on the Beatles' White Album there is a song called "Someday I'll Be Beck," and that means he came back as Beck. This and a bunch of conspiracy theories like Yoko Ono had John Lennon killed to keep everything, that actually the Central Intelligence Agency had him killed just like they had John Fitzgerald Kennedy killed, or that it was actually Paul McCartney who had him murdered are floating around the internet, and well, they're getting tangled up with the real story. What is certain is this massive hatred towards Mark Chapman causes the jury to deny him again and again. Parole. Mark Chapman maintains that for having killed John Lennon he deserves to be executed, but that Lennon, being a liberal, would be against the death penalty. And a bunch of other events keep happening too, because of this murder. Yoko Ono sues a Japanese subway company for using John Lennon's image without her permission on a commemorative ticket. In 2001, an artificial intelligence appears claiming to have been programmed with John Lennon's ideas where people can enter and chat with him. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison dies of cancer, and the world is not shocked, even though the doctor who is treating him forces the dying man to sign a guitar with his last gasps of life and then obviously auctions off this instrument. In 2006, the movie The Killing of John Lennon was released, and in 2007, a new movie about his life called Chapter 27 was released, where the killer is played by Jared Leto. Many Lennon followers try to sabotage the premiere of both movies. Meanwhile, Mark Chapman utilizes the opportunity to return to the spotlight. Because of these films, he says that he is now obsessed with actress Lindsay Lohan and plans to kill her. And all we have left now is Yoko Ono giving some quite strange shows. This is the tale of Mark Chapman and John Lennon's murder. Understanding the mindset of such individuals can be challenging. I hope you found it intriguing. If so, like, subscribe, and remember, you can watch this and other cases ad-free, 24 hours ahead of everyone else by clicking the join button below. Meanwhile, I'll stay indoors, avoiding any unexpected visits. I won't sign any records, but they're available on Spotify. Signings are currently off due to some fear after studying this story. I am Magnus Mephisto. We'll see each other in the next video. Bye.